Happy 2026, everyone! Let me start the new year with a question. What's the first feature-length animated film? I reckon most of you immediately thought of Disney's Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, and whilst that film changed the industry, it wasn't the first. The true answer is actually El Apostol, released way back in 1917 by Argentine director Quirino Cristiani. But here is the tragedy. Due to a fire in a film vault, that movie is lost forever. We can read about it, but we can never watch it. So when we talk about the oldest feature-length animated film that you can actually watch today, that title belongs to a film celebrating its 100th anniversary this year. The Adventures of Prince Achmed. Released in 1926, the film tells the tale of a prince who gets tricked by an evil sorcerer into riding a magical flying horse that risks him far away from his home. His journey back turns into an epic quest where he battles demons, befriends a powerful witch from a fiery mountain, and falls in love with a beautiful princess. The movie was written and directed by the legendary Lotte Reiniger, hopefully I'm pronouncing her name correctly, who was inspired by several stories from 1001 Nights to create the story. Now this film isn't Reiniger's first. In fact, she had already made 6 short films between 1919 and 1922, so it's clear that she wasn't lacking in experience. Her past filmography includes The Ornament of the Love-Struck Heart, The Star of Bethlehem, and her own adaptation of Cinderella. All of them bear Reiniger's trademark silhouette animation style, which was inspired by Asian shadow puppetry. Her love of theatre also contributed heavily to how she designed and animated her characters. She relied on strong silhouettes and expressive movement, much like silent film acting during the early days of film. And speaking of which, the idea of a feature-length animated film was considered quite absurd at the time. This is proven by the fact that major distributors refused to screen The Adventures of Prince Achmed, assuming that audiences wouldn't sit through an animated picture lasting longer than 60 minutes. On top of that, Reiniger's style was wildly different from what was common, especially when compared to animators from Fleischer Studios who focused on cartoony hand-drawn cell animation. But luckily for Reiniger, her early works caught the attention of Louis Hagen, a Berlin banker who agreed to finance the film. He even went the extra mile in providing Reiniger and her team with his attic to use as their studio throughout the entire production. Along with her husband Karl Koh and fellow artists Walter Ruttmann and Bertolt Bartosch, Reiniger spent 3 years painstakingly bringing the film to life, cutting thousands of figures out of paper and cardboard, animating them one frame at a time, and experimenting with techniques that had never been used before, all of which I will elaborate on later in this video. The story itself was assembled from various tales in 1001 Nights, as I mentioned before, rather than adapting a single narrative. Think of it like a best-of compilation. Reiniger took familiar characters and motifs, magical horses, wicked sorcerers, enchanted lands, and reshaped them into a flowing cinematic fairy tale. The result feels less like a traditional plot-driven film, and more like a dreamlike journey through myth and legend. Before we move on to the characters, if you like deep dives into animation history like this and want to see more forgotten gems, be sure to like the video, subscribe, and hit that notification bell. It's not much, but it really helps the channel, and I would deeply appreciate it. Now let's take a quick look at the characters. As a fairy tale, The Adventures of Prince Achmed doesn't aim for deep psychological or emotional complexity. Its characters are archetypes, symbolic figures designed to be immediately recognizable rather than deeply explored. Prince Achmed himself is the classic heroic lead, brave and impulsive, yet he becomes noble-hearted by the end. He isn't defined by internal conflict so much as by his actions, which is fitting for a silent film where movement and posture do most of the storytelling. He's the one character who goes for a clear arc, starting as gullible and even selfish, such as when he practically kidnaps Princess Pari Banu when they first meet, and then ending as a loyal and affectionate young man devoted to rescuing her after she's captured by the sorcerer and sold to the Emperor of China. Achmed comes across as somewhat unlikable in the first third, even rather disturbing with what he does. That is to say, it'd be impossible for me not to mention that, once the magical horse drops him off, among his initial questionable actions is to enter a building unknown to him, where he finds what appears to be a harem of women, and then his first impulse is to throw himself at them and start making out with them. Now granted, the women seem to be into it because the scene quickly escalates into them fighting over Achmed, who runs off before it gets any worse. I'll admit, it's one of the most amusing moments in the film. In the following scene, Achmed comes across Pari Banu, and this is where his behaviour at the start comes with trigger warnings. Not only does he watch her bathe without her knowing, but he chases her with the intention of marrying her, taking her magical feather cloak that would give her a means of escape. Naturally, this makes Achmed look pretty bad. However, he does end up showing remorse for his actions and expresses genuine affection for Pari Banu. We then see him at his best in how far he's willing to go to save her. Princess Pari Banu herself represents the idealized fairy tale heroine. Graceful and ethereal, she is less a fully developed character and more a symbol of love and longing. She's perfectly suited to Reiniger's delicate animation style, and was actually one of the most complex characters to animate thanks to the feathers and patterns on her clothing. The sorcerer serves as a clear antagonist, cunning, manipulative, and instantly attention-grabbing through his design. His sharp angles and exaggerated gestures make him immediately threatening, reinforcing his role as the trickster who sets the story in motion. One of the film's most memorable characters is the Fire Witch, ruler of the Fiery Mountain. She initially possesses a strong presence and authority, but later proves to be one of Achmed's most powerful allies. And finally, Aladdin, another hero whose journey intersects with Achmed's. His inclusion reinforces the mythic, interconnected nature of the story, where legends overlap and coexist, much like in real-world mythologies. Other characters include Achmed's father, the Caliph of Baghdad, his sister, Princess Dinarsade, and the Emperor of China. These characters are fairly minor and primarily exist to move the plot forward. While none of the characters receive extensive development, especially by today's standards, their simplicity allows the film's true focus, the animation, to shine. And speaking of which, this is where The Adventures of Prince Achmed truly earns its place in film history. This is genuinely one of the most visually striking films I've ever seen. Reiniger's silhouette animation style is instantly recognizable. Characters are rendered entirely in black, their identities defined by shape, posture, and motion rather than facial detail. You can tell each one of them apart. This forces the animation to communicate emotion through body language alone, a raised arm, a tilted head, or even sudden stillness. Despite being a silent film with title cards, much of the story is perfectly understandable without reading a single word. Every character moves in a very distinct way. Achmed has a swashbuckling physicality that matches his adventurous nature. Pari Banu moves with grace and elegance, almost like a ballerina. The sorcerer, meanwhile, is jerky and exaggerated, making him deeply unsettling. Reiniger's character animation is so clear and expressive that the audience can follow emotional beats purely through movement. Joy, fear, anger, and tenderness are all conveyed through rhythm and gesture rather than spoken dialogue. Colour also plays a crucial role in shaping the film's mood. Contrary to popular belief, colour existed in cinema long before films like The Wizard of Oz made it mainstream. In fact, filmmakers have been experimenting with colour since the early days of film. Though the characters remain black silhouettes, the backgrounds are tinted with vibrant colours that shift depending on the scene. Blues evoke night or mystery, reds signal danger and fire, and yellows represent daylight and optimism. These colour choices act like emotional signposts, helping guide the viewer and clearly distinguish each location. One of the film's most groundbreaking achievements is its use of depth. Reiniger and her team effectively invented an early version of the multiplane camera by layering multiple sheets of glass at different distances from the camera. This allowed foreground, midground, and background elements to move independently, creating a convincing sense of three-dimensional space, something that was incredibly difficult to achieve in animation at the time. This creates what we call the parallax effect, where foreground elements move faster than background elements. I mentioned this briefly in my Sleeping Beauty video, so check that out if you haven't already. This technique would later be refined and popularized by Disney over a decade later with Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, but Prince Achmed was already experimenting with it years earlier. They even created multiple versions of the same character at different sizes, smaller puppets for wide shots and larger ones for close-ups. The film is also packed with inventive visual effects. Smoke curls and dissipates, fire dances and flickers, magical transformations unfold seamlessly, and characters dissolve or reassemble in ways that feel effortless. Achieving these effects required immense creativity within strict limitations. Walter Ruttmann used materials like sand, soap, paint, and even wax to create many of the magical effects you're seeing. Atmospheric elements like stars were created by punching holes into cardboard and placing it against a bright light, whilst waves were animated using transparent paper. All of this is especially highlighted during the climactic fight with the demon hordes. Achmed and Aladdin confront a Hydra holding Pari Banu in the foreground, whilst the Fire Witch summons spirits to battle demons in the background. It honestly makes my head spin thinking how difficult and time-consuming all of this must have been. And yet, they pulled it off beautifully. Reiniger wasn't just animating within an existing medium, she and her team were actively inventing it as they went. For all its innovation and beauty, The Adventures of Prince Achmed is not without its shortcomings. As I mentioned earlier, some characters are underdeveloped, existing more as symbols than fully realised individuals. Motivations can feel thin, and relationships sometimes move too quickly. A prime example is the romance between Achmed and Pari Banu. Again, when they first meet, Achmed kidnaps her and steals her feathered cloak. Once he returns it, however, he immediately gains her respect, and even her affection. It happens very fast, but again, this is a fairy tale made in the 1920s, so it doesn't bother me too much. There are also moments where the story could benefit from greater clarity. Because the film weaves together multiple fairy tales, transitions between events aren't always smooth. Some plot threads, like Achmed's sister being forced to marry the sorcerer, are introduced and then sidelined until much later. Additionally, like many works of its era, the film contains rather outdated and uncomfortable ethnic stereotypes, like with the Emperor of China, or even the Sorcerer, who's referred to as the African Sorcerer. These do reflect the period in which the film was made, but they're still worth acknowledging today. That said, these flaws don't erase the film's achievements. They simply remind us that The Adventures of Prince Achmed is both a groundbreaking work of art and a product of its time. So when we ask what the first feature-length animated film was, the answer is still complicated. The true first may be lost forever, destroyed by time, neglect, or circumstance, but what we do have is something just as important, a film that survived. The Adventures of Prince Achmed isn't just the oldest feature-length animated film we can still watch today, it's proof that animation was born as an art form, meant to last, not a fleeting novelty. Long before animation became an industry, Lotte Reiniger was already treating it as cinema, expressive, poetic, and endlessly inventive. Made with scissors, paper, light, and extraordinary patience, The Adventures of Prince Achmed showcases techniques that wouldn't become widespread for decades. It reminds us that innovation doesn't always come from massive studios or technological leaps, but from artists willing to experiment and believe in the medium's potential. As the film celebrates its 100th anniversary, it stands as a quiet challenge to modern audiences and creators alike to remember where animation came from and to recognize voices that history too often overlooks. The Adventures of Prince Achmed isn't merely a relic of the past, it feels like a message from it, one that still flickers, dances, and endures a century later. If you enjoyed this video, please consider liking, commenting, and subscribing. I'm planning more deep dives into animation, and your support is greatly appreciated. Thanks for watching.